I'm Antonio Kung from Trialog, a software house. I'm leading the Paris project on surveillance and privacy. We're working on a framework, and we came up with a methodology for biometric systems, which led to a PIA, and we got the idea to see what is the current state of practice concerning privacy impact assessment. Okay, I'm going to chair, so I have nothing else to do than just to give the mic. We have a distinguished panel of 5 people. We have David Wright here, the founder of Trilateral. He has authored many books and papers on privacy, in particular authoritative book on privacy impact assessment. He will moderate. He will make a short presentation and moderate. Okay. Then the first speaker will be Johan Rambi. He is a privacy and security advisor for Alliander. Alliander is I think is the biggest Dutch electricity utility, and he supports his company with privacy and security assessments. Okay. Then we have Sarah Spiekermann. She chairs the Institute for Management Information Systems at Vienna University of Economics and Business. He has expertise in electronic privacy, disclosure behavior, ethical computing. She co-authored papers and documents on US, EU regulation for RFID. And she also authored this book on ethics, which I think is interesting. It's available on the web. You can buy it. Okay. Then we have Anderson Santana from SAP. He's a cloud security researcher. He coordinated some work on risk and trust for the EU FP7 cloud A4 cloud, and he will talk about the cloud PIA. Last but not least, we have Claire Gayrel from University of Namur, and she developed in the frame of Paris the methodology for balancing privacy and security in the design and deployment of biometric systems. So I give the floor to David Wright. He will moderate, but we will start with some small presentation.
Right, so I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes this morning. I just want to draw your attention to the development of various privacy impact assessments. I've listed, oh yes, let me just move that away. That's better. So I've just listed some of the principal developments in privacy impact assessment guidelines. Probably you're familiar with some or most of these, but I draw your attention in particular to the ISO guidelines that are now very close to being finished. I've been participating in the UK group that has been making, we like to think, some progress in the development of these PIA guidelines, and I think the draft now is in quite good shape. Article 33 of the GDPR is going to be a major initiative. What we don't know is what sort of guidelines will the Commission provide with regard to the conduct of a PIA. Will they follow, for example, the ISO guidelines, or will they follow some of the PIA methodologies developed elsewhere in Europe, such as the CNIL guidelines or the ICO in the UK. We also have some specialized PIAs. The RFID template was developed especially with the contribution of Sarah a few years ago, 4 years ago. And then we also have the smart meter DPIA template that Johan is going to talk about. The Australian guide to undertaking PIAs that came out a year and a half ago in May 2014, I think is especially very good PIA guidelines. And if you're still thinking about a good methodology, I would certainly encourage you to have a look at the Australian one. The New Zealand Privacy Commissioner put out a PIA handbook in the mid-1990s and then revised it a few years ago. That's probably the oldest guidance that exists. The Department of Homeland Security in the United States has produced an interesting guidance, and one of the interesting things about government PIAs in the United States is that they publish them on, or generally they publish them on the organization's website. So if you go to DHS or the FBI or any organization, you're going to find copies of the PIAs that they've done. And there's many others. Ireland has one, Hungary has one, Germany has one, the Netherlands has one. There's many others being developed in Europe. So the issue of what standard or what guidelines we should follow, I think, is a key issue. Some of the questions that I hope we will address during the course of this panel session are just listed here. I'm not going to leave this slide on very long, but I think that there's still quite a few questions that we need to address in Europe in terms of how data protection impact assessments or privacy impact assessments are going to develop. So with that, I'm going to conclude my short presentation and turn the floor over to Johan. So Johan, do you want to trade places?
Right, good morning. Since I'm not that tall, I will stand up and stand over here so that you could hear me and also see the slides. Yes, I will talk in 10 minutes. I've been instructed to keep the 10 minutes deadline, so I will talk very fast. I have a couple of slides to show you. I will talk about the data protection impact assessment template for smart grid and smart metering systems. This is an ongoing process to develop this template. A little bit about myself, but very shortly. We are a distribution system operator, a utility that serves electricity and gas in the Netherlands. And we are in the middle of an energy transition to keep up with the developments and to develop smart grid technology in our infrastructure. We had a big lesson learned in the Netherlands in 2009, and since that we are taking privacy into our attention and care. And since that moment we are very encouraging the energy sector to have privacy and security embedded in our processes. So that is, let's say, the reason. There is a European Commission initiative already going on that is within the Smart Grid Task Force from DG Enna. And this Smart Grid Task Force has a group, and this group is called Expert Group 2. This group is part of this development of the DPIA template. This template is part of a whole process that they have put in their mandate, in the mandate 490 for smart grid development. And since that moment, since 2012, we have put a lot of attention and effort to make that eventually a good instrument. In 2014, there was also official recommendation to develop this template. So now it's official, and we, with the coordination of the European Commission and also the support of and the opinion of the Article 29 Working Party, we're trying and we're developing this template to make it a good workable instrument. There is an opinion, official opinion from the Article 29 Working Party that they also recommend this DPA template for smart grid and smart metering systems. So eventually, because of the Article 33, impact assessment is mandatory, but this instrument is not mandatory. This is a highly recommendation to use this instrument to assess your privacy impact. And especially, of course, in the deployment of the smart grid and smart metering systems. You can see everything in the next PDF file that you can download from the European Commission website. We are now, because this template is already, let's say, in a first version 1.0, and we are now officially in a test phase. As also the Article 29 Working Party recommended to have a test phase of 2 years to test if this instrument, methodology, the steps are really workable, user-friendly, etc., to eventually use it in the practice and not eventually have it as paper that you put it in the closet. So we are now in a test phase that started in 2015, March 2015, and it will end in October 2016. And this test phase is under the coordination again from the Smart Grid Task Force. And all kinds of stakeholders are involved. So even as also the civil society, consumer organizations are involved, national data protection authorities are involved. So yeah, we are trying to have a big group of stakeholders to go through this test phase. But who should perform this test? Yeah, the data controllers in this case, and that's mostly the utilities if they are developing the smart grid and smart metering systems. So this group will test this template. And what is this template about? If you want to know more, you can also download this. It's public available, of course. And it's a step methodology where we are not going through a checklist. So it's not a checklist. It's a more process and part of a risk-based approach, of course. Also that is mandatory. So we have developed a methodology that you go through all kinds of risks that could occur in your smart grid design. Because again, this needs to be done in the early stage when you are want to design a smart grid or smart metering system. So it is basically a process where you classify the risks, the risk of data. And we have gathered, of course, all kinds of references and the lessons learned of earlier projects. Even the also the RFID DPIA, and also the CNIL methodology. So we have put them all in this this template, and yeah, set up with this document. This test phase, as I mentioned, we are testing it with all kinds of utilities. Alliander and EDP took the first, let's say, initiative to test it. And now other utilities will follow. So Enel have done it, but also now in the last meeting last week, Enexis and Iberdrola also have performed this workshop, this test workshop, and others will follow, because at the end we should have a final output of findings that improve this template, so that in 2017 we will have a next version that we can yeah, hopefully use. How I'm doing with the time, Antonio?
That's 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. Yes, so a little bit about this workshop to let you know.
And 5 minutes for questions.
And 5 minutes, okay, 2 minutes. So, if I do the counting well. So, I will tell a little bit about the workshop that we've done earlier already last year. To let you know that how we have done it. It's a multi-group of people, not from the expert, but also from the business, to do these workshops to, of course, assess a kind of use case, but to have a multi-stakeholder approach. We have done 2 workshops, one in Amsterdam and one in Lisbon. It was a combined workshop with EDP, and this was about smart metering use case, the collection of the customer data for billing purposes. That is the most obvious use case right now. Nice to experience that was that we had also observers, but also the participants of the DPA, and so that we could also elaborate how we should use the template, because in this template we also have described that the result should be sent to the DPA, but what will they do with that and how will they conduct it? So that was good feedback to know what on the other side will happen. So that was a nice collaborative approach, and of course from the European Commission representatives were there to follow the process. We had some points that we say, okay, that is good at this moment. I have put them, some of them, let's say the highlights. What was good was that if you have a multi-stakeholder approach, other roles, what normally in your organization or outside your organization will not go through these steps, they are now involved. So you have more involvement in your organization, and it increases the awareness then highly, because then the eyes will open and say, oh, I didn't know about that. Yes, you should. So it is a good awareness product. And it's all the findings, and we have a lot right now, that is increasing the usability. So we still follow the methodology, but the usability of this instrument, that's what we're testing, and we are also increasing that with the findings. Improvement, yes. We have one step that's pre-assessment. It's a very long step, and then we think it should be simpler. If you look up in this template, you should see that it's indeed a long step that could be shorter, with let's say 5 essential questions that you could ask. The risks should be more focused towards data protection and not about security. It is a little bit, let's say, a gray area when it's information security or it's data protection. There's always a discussion about availability, confidentiality, integrity, but some questions in this template are really about information security, and then it's, let's say, too much outside the whole data protection assessment. And we believe that an automated tool could really help us, because now it's just a Word document, and we are not in the 80s, so it is not from this time. And an automated tool will improve the guidance, will help the classification of the risks, and also the usability. We are collaborating with each other in a way that privacy, cybersecurity, and resilience is a very important topic for the energy sector. That's why we have set up this European Energy ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. This information sharing community, that's an initiative that we have established to talk more, to share more about privacy and data protection with each other within the energy sector. So with that statement, I want to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, we have time for one quick question. Yes, over here.
Pernille Jansen, local government Denmark. I was wondering, in the new regulation, in Article 33, there are some demands for these PIAs. I wonder, this template you are describing that you're going to test, is this the same demands, or are there any other demands in the templates than it described in the regulation?
We have not integrated all the demands, because in the last version there were some changes, and these demands we have also put them as findings. Oh, sorry. And we also gathered them to improve this next version. So the demands in the last version of the GDPR, we also put them back in this test phase, because this test phase already was started in 2015. So that's why we have not put them in this template yet. One thing to say is that this is a test phase that is 1.0 and 2.0, so we don't have any subversions in between. So that's why in this way you cannot have an iterative way of setting up new versions. So we have to wait till the next version.
Right. So I think we should move on with the next presenter.
Yes, thank you.
And if we have some time at the end, we could ask some further questions from the various presenters. So, Sarah, you're next.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. As perhaps some of you know, I was the author of this first PIA on written RFID that we negotiated with mostly retail and RFID industry, and then I have been following up on what is happening, what has happened in the past. Now, the RFID industry today is still very strongly driven by retailers worldwide, which means that there are hundreds of millions of RFID tags out there that are tagging every individual product. And I don't think this works.
No,
It does work? Okay. What is there is one organization, it's called GS1, and GS1 is the worldwide barcode organization that has also been strongly involved in lobbying how to do a privacy impact assessment, and obviously the goal was to make it as easy and as intransparent as possible. With our first agreement on how to do a PIA for RFID, we have actually achieved in the lobbying process a very nice way to do it. And then the problem was, though, that GS1's interpretation of how to do it was extremely fuzzy. And they brought out a tool right after the negotiations that they are still distributing in the retail industry, which looks like this. This is the interface where companies run through several questions, all of them very relevant for doing a privacy impact assessment, process-oriented. But the problem is basically that the questions are so fuzzy that a normal company would not be really able to answer them in a meaningful way. Which, I think the ambition of GS1 is to make it as easy as possible for companies, but by making it fuzzy and legally enforceable and debatable, it's also very difficult for companies. And let me give you an example here. You see here the entry of a retailer. This is like the gateway that people go in when they enter a store. And since this store is of our partner company Adler Moden, RFID enabled on the shop floor, you have to notify the consumer of the existence of tags on the shop floor. And you see here is the notification for the customer. And the PIA tool question is the presence of RFID reader clearly indicated? Yes. So this is the question here in the RFID PIA tool distributed by GS1, also still in the new version that was launched in July 2015 based on the 10 standard. It's the same question. Company wouldn't obviously answer yes because they cannot answer no, because in fact they have done something, but what they have done is obviously not acceptable from a consumer perspective, and as a result also not acceptable for the retailer itself, because obviously if there ever was a true legal course, they would lose out. Yeah? So I would say, and perhaps I skipped one slide that also may be interesting and important for you, is after our negotiations of the PIA, RFID PIA framework, I went out of this PIA specification process, and then the CNIL took over. It's a standardization body, and of course the standardization group was run by GS1, which means that a lot of the things that I could impede in the earlier version have re-entered the standard, including tables on pre-specification of risk before you even enter the risk assessment, which obviously doesn't make any sense, because the result of an impact assessment is an idea of the risk, of the privacy risk, and if you pre-specify the risk before you even start to do the assessment, it just doesn't make any sense. But people who run standardization groups and technical standardization groups, they have a very strong influence, and this is what happened. Anyways, there is a lot of effort, there is a lot of guidance now around, and we try to work with what's there. And we have, so my conclusion is, while PIA standards for RFID are well defined by now, effective and timely tools for industry are still missing. So trying to see what's there, how can we now make it applicable to the industry in an easy way? And you, David, also pointed out some important criteria for what makes a good privacy impact assessment. And one of them is the minimization of administrative burden. And this is what we are attempting. So we now have 4 practical objectives to build a privacy impact assessment tool that makes it really easy for industry to come up with a good privacy impact assessment that ensures compliance but also ensures privacy. And I give you a very, very short guidance, tour through this tool, which we built in competition to the Excel spreadsheet from GS1. And as you see here, as of course you start with a few descriptions, that some background information. I'm not sure you can read it, but the first step is the description of your application. So how do you actually collect the data? And most importantly, what are your data flows? Because a privacy impact assessment, to make a good assessment of privacy, the essential turning point is your data flows. And we give companies, because they have modeled their data flows in very different ways, we give them just the possibility to upload their PDF and document what kind of documentation they might have anyways. And then, you see, the interesting thing is this looks like a process. But what this tool is really doing is it has already thought through a proper PIA process and looks at what should come out of a good PIA process, and then checks, and the company just checks whether it is actually on track, and then receives a risk feedback. So let me demonstrate that with one example. Here it's, come back to the example of notification that I just showed you, the notifying the customer who walks into a store. And this PIA tool asks, so what notice do you have in place? And then the people in the company, they can check, oh, I have a website, I give people information about RFID on the website, on RFID readers, whether RFIDs are on tags. And right next to it, it says, what is the visibility? The visibility and accessibility of this information. And the one who is conducting the PIA can say, oh, the visibility is high, medium, or low. And in such a case, like the example I have just given, obviously, the person doing the PIA would say, okay, we have a notification of the RFID reader, but the visibility is low. And if the visibility is low, then this shows here on every single process step, we have a barometer that gives the company or the compliance advisor feedback to what extent does the company run the risk of non-compliance with the law and non-compliance with the expectations on privacy. And so you go through all those very practical steps. One I would like to also point out to you, you check your privacy policy, which is your most important communication medium with the customer. You upload the privacy statement that you give your customers, and then here on the right side you see buttons like purpose specification, which is a legal requirement to put purpose specification in the privacy policy, right? And so the person who runs through the PIA has to look into the company's privacy policy and find the passage that actually deals with purpose specification, right? And then it highlights the passage that deals with purpose specification, presses this button here, and so runs he or herself through the policy explanations that they give to customers. So and as a result, they obviously recognize at the end what risk they are really accumulating in terms of compliance and in terms of respecting people's privacy, and they get a final barometer on where they stand based on various dimensions of compliance. Okay, so this is where we stand, and in our EU project Ceramis, we are completing this tool, and I think it will be available mid next year. Yeah. What is next? Now I have realized that obviously privacy is only one of several values that are important to people. Autonomy, transparency, accountability, dignity. There are a lot of values that are at stake as we build systems. And so I have published a book that has just arrived this January, and if you want, you can take some flyers here. I put them here with a coupon. And what I do is I take the methodology that we developed for privacy impact assessments, and instead of putting privacy at the center, I put another value in the center, like autonomy or transparency. I give you a very quick example. So here I have privacy vis-a-vis an RFID-enabled shopping mall, for example. And there are value dams, also things that might hamper and impede privacy in an RFID-enabled shopping mall. For example, to not be informed about RFID collection, and then I have controls or development goals. I can do the same thing when I take freedom. For example, here a value dam might be that my attention is directed or manipulated. Second degree freedom. So a development goal would be to avoid third-party manipulation. And then, if I have this development goal, I can run through an impact assessment and see to what extent this is fulfilled by my system. So we can build not only privacy by design, but ethics by design. And all of that is specified in this book, where you can get some extra information here on the site. Thank you very much.
Right, so maybe we could have one quick question, one short response. Yes, back in the corner.
Victor from Vodafone. Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. Just one question. How do you see the suitability of this methodology in, let's say, agile software development environment? this works very well when you're assessing kind of like a stable known problem, perhaps, where that is not bound to change rapidly over time. But I think the realities of the modern software development is that it's very agile process. The object under review changes as part of the implementation. There's even something called continuous deployment. So the code goes live as it's being written to fix problems. So just wanted to hear your observations on what is the right methodology to deal with that sort of
Sarah, do you want to take the...
agile development for me starts in the system design phase. But according to system analysis and design processes that are well accepted, first of all, we have before that an analysis phase, and before that we have initiation and planning and project selection phases. So the design phase, in which agile or any kind of iterative development comes into play, and where engineering groups start to kind of work on the system, comes after requirements are specified. Now, since this is, I'm aware that in practice, in companies, this is not how it's done today. And I would say that's the sickness of the software industry. And it's a problem. And it puts companies at risk. And it leads to the current phenomenon that companies are not in control of their data infrastructures, because especially agile computing and iterative development that specifies to not document too much, and that's a problem. Yeah. But I believe that if you have well priorly defined your requirements and made some decisions on where you're going, then you can also have the normal iterative various forms of programming afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Next, Anderson.
Thanks, Antonio and David, for the invitation for this panel. So I will present an approach for data protection impact assessment for cloud, which was developed with many collaboration of many people. Some of them are in the room, like Shiani, Rehab, Lorenzo is perhaps there. So it was developed in the context of the Cloud Accountability Project A4 Cloud. So I will leave the slide a few seconds so you can have information later. But what I want to focus on is on the difficulties we found in devising a tool for privacy impact assessment for cloud, and what would be the barriers that would be common for our approach and some cloud-specific issues. So the difficulties we share with the other approaches I have seen here are, in my opinion, the lack of awareness about privacy risk from the person conducting the assessment, from the organization conducting the assessment, the subjectivity that exists in quantifying risk. For instance, when looking at the RFID question, I put yes because I put the logo RFID. So there is a subjectivity in interpreting the questions and also in quantifying the risk assessment. Is it a low risk or high risk to process personal data in the cloud? So this is an open question that we have seen in the panel yesterday, for instance, talking about risk-based approach for devising regulations. Who is going to say what is high and what's low risk? Is it the organization conducting the assessment? So here I'll present the approach we took in A4 Cloud, and you have your own opinion if it's a good approach or not and what should be improved. Of course, data subjects are out of the loop. It's not a question that we are answering here in this work. Anyway, so the PIA for cloud is not so different from the other approach, but there are some concerns that people should be aware of, which are the cloud-specific issues. So the cloud is geographically distributed, so it's very easy to cross borders and find your data in other jurisdictions with different regulations and different concerns about privacy. The cloud is also multi-tenancy, it's multi-tenant. So in public clouds, you share the infrastructure, you share the computing resources with other organizations you don't know, and you don't know their objectives and what security the platform is offering to you in terms of isolation. Third, the cloud provider you have a contract with may have other contracts with third parties, and you may not be aware of that. So there is often lack of transparency about agreements between different cloud providers that may be hosting servers in other locations. And that is a very widespread practice in the internet and in the cloud. And when these supply chains are very long, who is accountable in case of problems? So these are the overall questions that organizations should ask their cloud providers to provide clear answers about. ENISA has elaborated a report a few years ago that is still pretty relevant, enumerating a number of risks that you should care about when using cloud services. So they structured a number of risks in different categories, and they not only consider cloud-specific risks, but overall risks in the usage of cloud. So there is a list I will not detail here, and it's pretty well defined what kind of risks affect the cloud, and there is some explanation, very detailed explanation of what are the elements concerning a given cloud risk. For instance, what are the typical vulnerabilities affecting the risk of having your data locked into a provider? You have the vulnerabilities, the assets, and the general indication of the likelihood that this would become a problem for you when using cloud services. So what we did was to adapt this to concrete scenarios. So if you select a given cloud provider, what would be the risk of locking for that provider? But how to do that? You need to assess the information coming from that provider, that specific provider. So we use the NISA approach to analyze public information available on the CSA star. CSA is a Cloud Security Alliance, and it has a transparency approach to motivate providers to disclose some information about their security practices. So in the CSA star, you find a list of providers. By the time we did this study, there were more than 50 providers in the list. We select a number of them to analyze how they are answering to security control implementation questions. So the CSA has an approach called the Cloud Control Matrix, and an associated one called Cloud Controls Matrix, and associated one with specific questions about all the controls on the Cloud Controls Matrix, which is a collection of security controls appearing in many different security information security standards, ISO and NIST and whatever. And these are very well organized and categorized, and the cloud providers were invited to answer voluntarily questions related to those controls. For instance, here is an example of questions. In fact, there are two questions. Is your organization insured by a third party for losses? Do your organization's service level agreement provide tenant remuneration for losses? So very clear questions. So it's a similar problem to what Sarah mentioned. So the cloud provider here, he decided to group the answers. So the initiative from CSA would assume that the provider answers yes or no. But the providers, they took their own way to answer it. They grouped the questions and provide a single answer with an explanation of how they do it. So here is the explanation provided by this example provider. They said, oh, okay, we are certified for ISO 27001. Dot. Dot mean. So it's up to the customer to interpret if the answer is yes or no. Well, I don't know if the answer is yes or no. So what we did is that we collected all the answers from 50 providers, almost 50 different providers, and we used machine learning to classify the answers for us. Of course, there's a margin for interpretation, for error, but it was the quickest way because we had more than 8,000 different questions to analyze. So using this, you assign the scores to the answers, to the controls mitigating a given cloud risk from the NISA 35 different risks. And we did this mapping between controls and threats. And using this mapping, we counted how close to fulfilling all necessary controls to mitigate a risk the providers are reaching. We grouped all these risks in 3 categories to do a quick analysis of this. And we used this approach to measure the exposure of a provider to one of those risks. The problem with this is that we did this study in 2014. Now we are in 2016, so the providers changed their practices, they changed the answers, the questionnaire changed, so you cannot compare the situation now and the situation before, and we used also machine learning for doing this assessment. So these results were made available in a tool that we used to combine to our privacy impact assessment approach for cloud, which I will detail next. So one of the difficulties here is how to use reliable sources for evaluating cloud risks and how to be sure that these sources are up to date. We heard from CSA that they want to modify their questionnaire for information security controls. They want to impose an online questionnaire and you cannot provide other answer than yes or no. So it would be easier to assess cloud providers. But I'm afraid that cloud providers would refrain from disclosing the information in that way. But let's see. 2 minutes. So the PIA approach for cloud is very similar to what Sarah presented, except that we have a different questionnaire that is much more targeting SMEs, which lack expertise for conducting the PIAs, and also, but why not, startups, who are very ambitious to collecting a lot of personal data, of course. And the approach has 2 phases, a pre-screening phase and a screening phase with full questionnaire. After responding to the questionnaire, the user will have a report showing this as similar to this screenshot, where you have different categories. Yes, different categories for the questions answered with an assessment. For instance, sensitivity of the data process is high, medium, low, etc. How is this computed? Associating a score to each selected answer by the user. So there are answers, there are questions about the project that look like this, and there is a user interface that informs about the consequences of choosing a given option. In this case, we ask, do the outcomes of the decisions you have effect on the individuals whose information is performed? So the guy says yes, and the tool informs what could be the problem about that. This was one of the principles we followed to try to create more awareness about the impact assessment, about the privacy risks. So yes, the tool output would look like this. You have another session about the cloud risks. So by selecting a cloud provider, we go to our database, we retrieve the assessments we did previously, and we display this information to the user. These are the characteristics of our tool. So we used a number of resources. David mentioned in his introduction a number of guidelines, not all of them, but many of them. And the open points I would like to expose here is that, okay, by using a tool, you need to answer a number of questions. For instance, are the information sources used correct, complete, and up to date? So it's a difficulty you would have in creating any tool for data protection impact assessment. What are the sources of information are using to assess risks? And how to prevent the user from assuming that this substitutes legal advice. So it's a concern that we had, that some organizations would say, okay, the tool is saying me that it's low risk, so I can go to my processing, or the tool is saying it's too high risk, so I should not proceed. So it would refrain users from creating innovations because they are using the interpretation that the tool is given to them. So of course we have to have human beings in the loop to have a correct assessment, of course. And how these reports can be used, how the assessment can be used as a accountability mechanism in practice. For instance, if one of the risks materialize, materialize, then the organization cannot say, I was not aware of the risk because they conducted the assessment. But they perhaps told that the controls in place would fully mitigate the risk, and that was not what happened in reality. So one of your screenshots, when there was an assessment of the effectiveness of the controls, I saw most of them were 4 or 5. I think the highest values. So it's a similar problem of saying, yes, my RFID identification is visible, clearly visible. So there is a lot of subjectivity in the assessments, and that would be a problem to address.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anderson. So we could have, again, one please, very short question, and please, very short response. Yes, yeah. No, that's you, yes.
The question is to you, but of course I would be pleased to see someone else that could integrate. The question is, have you, and all organizations, be them public bodies or private companies, also they have their own IT security management. Now the question someone is going to raise is, shall we do that from scratch for personal data when we already have, a process for IT security risk management? Have you thought of that in your methodology? How do you do that? How do you think it could be a plugin? It's not a plugin because we know that certain data protection principles are outside the remit of IT security, like, I don't know, necessity, proportionality, purpose limitation, the proper legal basis. How do you manage this issue?
David Wright has a report defending the integration of privacy impact assessment in the overall risk management of the organization. So the basic thing is to do that, to include in the process of risk management, and then in practice, I cannot know, I cannot tell you how they would associate the information security risk assessment with the privacy impact assessment, because in essence they are not the same things, related but not exactly the same things. So I think that at least you should involve the DPO in the risk assessment part, but for small organizations it would be clearly also an issue.
Good. Thank you, Anderson. So next, Claire, you're on.
Okay, so this is a little bit the other part that I will talk about, the privacy impact assessment and the legitimacy, proportionality to recourse to biometric system in my case, because I have tried to work on assessing the opportunity to use biometrics. So our approach is common to many PIA. We use the reflexive dimension of PIA, meaning that we ask open questions in our questionnaire about what is the purpose of your system, have you envisaged alternative to biometrics, etc. So in order to generate reflexivity in the minds of decision makers. But we have worked more specifically on an evaluation dimension with closed questions, and we try to identify very essential, relevant criteria that are very, very essential in assessing the proportionality of a biometric system in order to generate an evaluation that could be useful to the user in order to determine whether it is fine to go on the biometric project or whether he should abandon or reconsider its project. So the scope of our PIA covers the private sector only. It does not cover forensic purposes, border control, national identification purposes, because it is, in general, subject to the adoption of national legislation, and so the balance is done by the legislator, and so it's another context, and then done the balancing. Instead, I wanted to address the use of biometrics in the private sector in order to enter in sport facilities, to enter in sport facilities or kindergarten, in schools, in order to access to your professional computer, in order to access to your professional catering, all that kind of uses that are currently widespreading in Europe, and for which there is no formal evaluation of the proportionality of recourse to biometrics. And so my PIA addresses only the impacts on individuals' privacy. We do not assess the risks and impacts for the organization. It is outside the scope of my work. It is not outside the scope of my interest, but in this case, it was not my objective. So we divided our questionnaire in two phases. The first one is called the opportunity phase, because we want first to ask to the data controller if he really needs biometrics, considering the circumstances. And so we want to help him to assess the overall proportionality of the recourse to biometrics in the first place. And then, if this first phase is satisfactory, he goes on to a consultation of stakeholders and the design of the system and how the enrollment is carried out, matching and with all details as to the running of the biometric system. And I will talk mainly about the assessment of the opportunity to use biometrics. This was my main research in this work. So the question is basically, which relevant criteria to assess the proportionality of biometric systems? So I used many sources, of course, Working Party 29 opinions, but ECHR case law, because in this case it's really a human rights matter. Any collection of biometric data is characterized as an interference into individuals' rights under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Council of Europe reports and recommendations existing in this field. Of course, academic work, and the one of Elskind is very, very valuable. She's really a very important expert in this field. But I needed further knowledge in the practice, in the field, in order to know also myself, to build my own opinion regarding the admissibility, proportionality of biometrics. And so I turned to France, where the use of biometric is subject to prior authorization of the CNIL, the French DPA. And so they enacted some permanent authorization for certain types of biometric systems, but for all others, any data controller has to ask the prior authorization. And the CNIL publishes all its deliberations, so it makes it accessible documentation as to the practice and where we are presently in the deployment of biometrics in our everyday life. So I covered 10 years of deliberation. This, in practice, it's about 5,000 systems that are presently deployed in France, and most of them are these relating to these permanent authorizations, and only about 2% have been rejected and refused by the CNIL. The context where biometric systems are most deployed is first the work environment, indisputably. It's really in this context where biometrics apparently is perceived as the most useful and necessary for employers, but then in schools, and in particular to access and organize access to catering in school, and manage the billing of the meals, etc. In the research area, and in the commercial environment, it's only very, very few cases. I mean, sport facilities or centers where recreational places. But this is a coming market, so this is likely to become much more the case in the future. And so, again, the context where data controller requests special authorization, so 6 for special authorization and are this one. And in general, in the case of employees, it's always for security, access control, security-related purposes. While in the case of customers, it's the rationale behind it, the fight against fraud. And they want to have to be sure of the identity of their customer to access the swimming pool, because you have a 10 times access, card, for instance, or things like that. So this is basically the CNIL's approach. They distinguish the categories of people enrolled. It's implicit, it's not explicit, but it is a criteria that I found out. They were used to distinguish biometric data leaving trace and biometric data leaving no trace, although it is outdated, and they abandoned it recently. And they distinguish also whether the purpose is a general security purpose or whether you have a strong imperative of security. And then a very important criteria for the CNIL is the question of the storage, whether it is central, decentralized. So my criteria are a little bit different, the one that I have pushed for in my PIA based on other sources as well. And so categories of people enrolled, I kept this one. And so I think it's useful to distinguish whether you are enrolling minors, employees, customers, or other. Of course, I do not have an exhaustive list of the type of data subjects that could be enrolled in biometric system. So I relied on what is presently the most predominant cases, you know. Then, instead of the storage only, I first introduced the question of the functionality of the system. And in biometrics, we distinguish identification system and verification system. And then the type of storage. And it's opposing centralized storage and decentralized storage or storage on individual devices. Another criteria is the question of the legal basis. So the legal basis to deploy biometric system, you need one in Article 7 of the directive. And in this case, it may be consent or legitimate interest of the data controller. Consent in the case of minors and customers. And you cannot invoke validly legitimate interest to impose a biometric access control to your customers or minors. So you will need their consent in these cases. So I asked, well, are you committed to fulfill all these conditions? If they are committed, the consent will be presumed valid. If they are not, it will be considered as weak. In the case of employers, instead, it is the legitimate interest of data controller to, they cannot rely on consent because of the subordination relation between the employees and their employer. And it is the condition to obtain a valid consent will be much more complicated together. So they rely in general on this legitimate basis. And so this is my table of impact that I have produced. So I have 4 criteria: the categories of persons, the legitimacy, the functionality, and storage. And the combination of the answers to each of these questions generates a score that will further, according to your score, tells you whether your system is likely to present low, medium, high, or very high impact on individuals' rights to privacy, and therefore proportionate or disproportionate interference into these rights. So 4 criteria only, but already 48 different hypotheses. And so it's quite a lot. So of course, each time you add a criteria, you multiplicate the number of different hypotheses, and so you need to do the assessment again and check whether it makes sense. The scoring makes sense from a legal perspective. So that's why I tested different criteria, but I kept these 4 that appear to have at least some sense. And so the idea is to provide a very short evaluation, but with some explanation, to explain to the data controller if he should reconsider to abandon, the project, or maybe he should turn to a decentralized storage or things like that. Voilà. Thank you for your attention.
Brilliant. So maybe we could have one question for Claire. No? In that case, maybe we could open up for questions for all of the presenters then. So if you have some questions you'd like to ask any of the presenters, please raise your hand. No?
I have a question.
I don't see anybody. No? Where? Oh yes, okay.
Sarah, we have 4 questions. We have
all right. Yes. Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, it's a question actually for Claire from the last presentation. Are you proposing, so if we take an example where the biometric system is either closely integrated with a non-biometric system or is using several different modalities, we have to conduct different assessments for each sort of module of the system, or for the system as a whole?
No, you may need to do different assessment, but we are focusing on the collection of biometric data, transformation into template, condition of storage, and legitimacy to use biometrics. But of course, in some systems, you need more data because you are deploying an identification system, for instance, so you need other identifiers. But in most of them, you won't need, in verification system, you may not need to collect any identifiers. Just at the time of enrollment, you know that the person is working for you. So you enroll the person and then you do not keep any other kind of personal data. So in the second phase, we ask, are you collecting other personal data? But it's only open questions, and we come back to a more traditional type of PIA, you know, with open question and open answers, free text answers.
Yes, Sarah, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Oliveira, on what you presented. Perhaps we can go back to your slide where you, I think you made an analysis, an automated analysis of the risk, and you mined various text documents.
Yes.
And I didn't quite understand what exactly did you, what did you mine and how did you calculate the risk scores?
Mm-hmm. So this is documented in one of the papers we had in Utility and Cloud Computing in 2014. So I have some backup slides. Yeah. So the providers provide the answers to the Cloud Security Alliance consensus initiative in free text. So we classified the questions in the answers in a number of categories. Categories is clearly yes, clearly no, yes under some conditions. For instance, you can implement that feature if you pay more. It's not applicable to our service, or the control is not available in our service. So we classified all the answers. We here have a slide showing for some example providers how many controls are implemented and how many answers we classified in this way. We used the WECA tool, so maybe you heard about it, for using this automated classification. So there was a lot of manual work to extract the answers from the providers because they provide in several different formats, Excel, PDF, Word, etc. And then our methodology has this approach for calculating the risks, have probability and impact. We use the same guidelines as provided by ENISA, and we have some simple formulas to count how many controls mitigating a given risk are implemented by the provider, and we have this vulnerability index. And that's the way we did it. After, the customer, the user of the approach, he can fine-tune saying what are the assets that are more important to my case, mm-hmm. and provide weights such that he can adapt the approach to his environment, to his assessment of a cloud service. So if you want more information, we have the paper on UCC 2014.
Thank you. I would like to have the paper.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes. Let's ask concise questions, concise responses, so we can get as many as possible in the next 5 minutes. So, yes, you.
This is more a comment. So I have more than 10 years of experience of deploying these privacy review processes in very complex global technology environments. And my experience, having gone through the trial and error of what works and what doesn't, is that first of all you have to actually identify the business processes that are being used in business and adapt your privacy process around the actual business process. You can't show up with a straitjacket privacy process that you expect everyone else to bend around. It just doesn't work that way, even if we would like to do it that way. The second point that I have learned is that exactly what the other gentleman here highlighted. So the security teams really are our allies, and if we can tailor our processes so that it works together with the security process. In my pretty much done a security and privacy assessment and assurance process. That really will lead to success. And the third point is that at least if you work in a large technology company, the spectrum of things you actually have to manage is so broad that you cannot have a different privacy impact assessment for RFID or medical devices or something. Instead, you need to have like a master process where you have certain process steps that where certain privacy activities take place in certain different parts of the actual business development process, and then you have specific requirements for example, RFID or medical devices that you test again. And often you don't really even know what you are going for, so you just have to have a general understanding of what the privacy requirements are, and then you make the requirements as part of the process, because there are new things coming up all the time.
I would have a question for you, which is what is the duration of the average duration of this assessment of these projects, and what are the size of the organizations? How many employees they have?
100,000 employees, currently 140,000. So in my previous employment, we were doing, with 5 guys, we were doing more than 150 privacy assessments every month on a very agile business development process. So it's, but then again, if you do have like a massive IT reorganization project, then the assessment is very different than it is for update in an existing mobile application.
Right, yes.
I think the tools which are presented are very interesting, but the problem is a bit what the other question was saying. The primary concern of all businesses, governments, are not always privacy nor security. So when we give tools to them, we have to be aware of the fact that it's not their primary concern. So if it was already difficult with one question to ask them if they give the good information to the person, it will be more difficult to them. They will have less motivation to respond to 5 questions. So I think you have also to look for allies to make awareness. For example, in the case of the shop, it could be consumer organizations. And for workers, it could be trade unions. So I think we have to make tools who are also accessible to other actors to make awareness.
So we have the panel wants to react. So first of all, Sarah and John.
As first of all, I think the biggest alliance we have is the new data protection regulation, and for companies, it's absolutely essential to comply with the law. And these tools and processes help them to enter a wide area of law instead of staying in a gray area of law with the sanctions foreseen. It's very important to follow this kind of processes. But I also wanted to comment on the earlier speaker. I think you are correctly to say we need to consider the business processes. And I would go even further. We have been always looking at business processes, but very little so at data flows and at the various distinct systems that are supplying the data to the process workflow steps. And in privacy and security, it's a lot about data flows. Yeah.
Johan?
Yeah. Also, reacting on your approach, but also the question that was raised earlier about privacy and security, I believe highly in this integrated risk approach, integrated risk management approach. And what we have experienced, that a tool cannot work if your organization is immature about that. So, and if you leave it up to the expert will not come to the business. Can I finish?
Very quickly.
Yeah. So always use the risk owner and the business to conduct this privacy impact assessment.